Good morning. Today we're continuing our reading of The Wild Robot Escapes by Peter Brown. This recording is made with the permission of Little Brown Books for Young Readers. Chapter 59. The Strange Wilderness. Another gloomy day had settled over the mountains. Here and there the sun broke through the clouds and bright streaks came down like spotlights. One of those bright streaks swept over a rugged mountainside and found our friends. For a moment, the robot and the goose basked in the warm sunlight. Then the patch of light moved and rolled on into the next valley, where it sparkled across a strange industrial site. A patchwork of large, boxy structures was nestled among the trees. Broken walkways clung to the walls. Ramps and pipes slanted up from holes in the ground. The robot's computer brain detected and identified the site. It was a deserted coal mine. This was a strange kind of wilderness. Scattered throughout that mountain range were ghosts of human activity. Overgrown railways, rusted automobiles, spindly towers perched on mountaintops, faded signs with messages like "No trespassing" and "No hunting." It seemed humans had once lived and worked in this wilderness, only to leave it all behind. In places, though, there was still activity. Robot activity. Armies of robot workers methodically dug new tunnels and built new dams and worked in new mining operations. They took down abandoned buildings and hauled away truckloads of litter. Our friends were curious about these working robots, but they kept a safe distance and went on their way. Chapter 60, The Hunters. Crack! A gunshot echoed through the mountains. There weren't many hunters willing to trek into that wilderness, but those who did were serious. They camped out, wore camouflage, and fired traditional rifles for the sport of it. Roz and Brightbill were desperate to stay clear of the hunters. However, that was proving difficult. The trees were tightly packed together, and the undergrowth was tough and tangled. So they followed the deer paths that cut through this part of the forest. But they never knew when or where the next shot would be fired. Crack! The gunshots were going louder. Our friends slowed to a crawl, afraid of being seen or heard. And then the chatter of the forest animals fell silent. Crack! A bullet whizzed through the undergrowth, and a deer went bounding away. At the same time, birds screeched and flapped into the air. Unfortunately, one of those birds was Brightbill. Scared and confused, the young goose fluttered up to a tree limb just as two hunters emerged from the bushes. "What's a goose doing alone in these mountains?" said Hank, staring up at Brightbill. "And what's it doing in a tree?" "There must be something wrong with it," said Miguel. "Maybe you should put it out of its misery." Hank reloaded his rifle. "We're here to hunt deer," he said, "but it looks like we're going to be having goose for dinner." Had the hunters known Brightbill the way we do, reader, I'm sure they would have left him alone. But they knew nothing about him. To them, Brightbill was just another goose, a meal, and they were getting hungry. The hunter raised his rifle. He took a deep breath. His finger reached for the trigger, and then a fierce gust of wind suddenly blew across the forest floor. No, not wind. Footsteps. Something was stomping toward the hunters. Their rifles were ripped away, bent into hooks, and thrown aside. The men had hunted all manner of beasts, but they'd never come across well, they didn't know what the thing was. It looked like a tree stump standing on two long roots, with branches hanging from its sides. The men stumbled backwards, eyes and mouths opened wide. They turned and ran, their terrified noises trailing through the leaf litter. The goose was terrified too. He slumped off his branch into his mother's arms. The poor bird was trembling with fear, but he was unharmed. "I am so sorry, Brightbill," said the robot. "I should have acted sooner. You are safe now." Chapter 61, The Guide. A light drizzle was falling on the travelers, although they weren't actually traveling at the moment. They were standing still and staring up at a steep mountain of rocks. The robot had plenty of rock climbing experience, but one bad fall out there and she could be stranded forever. So Roz carefully picked her way up the slippery slope, while Brightbill fluttered alongside of her. They hadn't gone far when there came the sound of hooves clattering on the stone, and then a horned creature leaped from the midst and smashed right into the robot. Clang! Roz went flying backward. Clang! Roz crashed onto the ground. Standing on the rocks above the robot was a wild ram. He had big, curling horns and a crazed look in his eyes. Brightbill flew to his mother's side, ready to defend her. "Stay away from my mama!" he hissed, spreading his wings. But rather than charging, the ram hung his head and started to cry. "Oh, I'm so sorry," he blubbered. "I don't want to hurt anyone. Sometimes I just lose control and smash things. I feel really awful about it, I do." Roz brushed herself off. "I believe those are your instincts," she said. "We all have them. They can be very powerful. I only hope your instincts do not end up breaking me." "Don't worry," the ram sniffed. "I'll try not to let my instincts break you." "I appreciate that," said the robot. "My name's Thud," said the ram. "Which way are you headed?" "We are trying to find our way out of these mountains," said Roz. "But they never seem to end." "You're almost there," said Thud. "Let me show you the way. It's the least I can do for smashing you." The ram pranced away and led our friends to a narrow path that wound up the rocky mountainside. Roz tried to stay close, but Thud was born to climb. He easily scrambled up the steep slopes and vanished into the mist. A minute later, his friendly voice called out, "For a creature without hooves, you're not a bad climber." And there he was, peering down from the cliff ledge. The path opened into a foggy meadow where a whole flock of wild sheep were grazing. They reminded Roz of the cows grazing in the pasture, and she wondered how the hilltop farm was doing without her. Thud pranced through the flock. "These are my new friends," he announced without stopping. "They're lost, so I'm guiding them out of the mountains." The sheep raised their heads. Thud had a habit of making weird friends, but these two were definitely the weirdest. The flock watched as the ram, the robot, and the goose continued up the mountain and disappeared into the mist. Higher and higher they climbed, above the tree line, to where there were only rocks and scrubby plants and trickling mountain streams. They occasionally came upon a dirt-soaked road or a hiking trail, and the ram trotted across casually, while our friends crept across cautiously. At one point, the ram got that crazed look in his eyes again. His horns came flying at the robot, and she jumped out of the way just in time. Then Thud cried and apologized for his instincts. Roz forgave him, and the group carried on. They finally hiked up from the mist and onto a mountain ridge. Above, the sky was clear. Below, a blanket of puffy clouds spread outward in every direction. The sun was setting, and the western clouds were burning pink. Roz thought of the mountaintop on her island. If only she could be watching the sunset from that peak instead of this one. But they still had a long, long way to go. Thud pointed our friends to one last path. "This will take you down from the mountains and through the foothills," he said, smiling. The ram suddenly got that crazed look in his eyes again, and the robot prepared to jump. But this time Thud pulled himself together. He said goodbye to the travelers, and then he pranced away. Chapter 62, The Showdown. Daybreak in the foothills, and thick gray fog was everywhere. With such poor visibility, the travelers relied on their other senses. They smelled the salty air. They felt the sandy soil. They heard seagulls screeching and the waves breaking. and they heard the long, low note of a ship's horn. Somewhere in the distance, hidden by the fog, was the ocean. As if to answer the ship, there came another long, low note. But it wasn't a horn. It was a howl. A wolf was following our friends. Brightbill beat his wings and squawked, "Mama, run!" Roz ran downhill deeper into the gloom. Her feet stomped on the sandy soil, leaving behind a trail of footprints. There was no time to hide her tracks, so she just kept running. Blurry shapes faded in and out of the fog, and her eyes darted around to see if they were rocks, or bushes, or wolves. But the robot should have watched where she was going. She slipped and thumped into the sand, and before she could get up, Shadow was on top of her. The wolf was heavy and strong. He pinned Roz to the ground and locked his teeth to her tool belt. At last he had caught his prey. Violently, wildly, he thrashed the robot from side to side. Roz tried to squirm free, but Shadow's grip was tight. There was only one thing to do. She reached down beside the wolf's snarling jaws, fumbled with the buckle, and suddenly she was loose. Shadow staggered back, the belt hanging from his mouth, as Roz stomped away. Brightbill had been circling over her head this whole time, and now he squawked desperate warnings to his mother. "Look over those rocks! Shadow is gaining on you! There are buildings ahead!" Roz burst through a row of hedges onto the main street of a seaside village. It was still early, and it was still foggy, and Roz was halfway through the village before anyone saw her. A man had just left for his morning walk with when the robot and the wolf came galloping down the street. The man decided his walk could wait, and he hurried back inside. The shadow swiped at Roz's heels, but the robot leaped away. She soared over a house and landed on the other side. The wolf dashed around the courtyard, only to see her leaping away once more. This time Roz landed in the shallow water. Waves gently sloshed against her ankles. The robot backed up into the ocean, up to her waist, and then automatically stopped. Her survival instincts would not let her go any further. "There's nowhere left to run," Shadow growled as he prowled onto the beach. "Either fight or swim." Roz was trapped. Her body lurched forward and backward as her computer brain struggled to find an escape. Then Brightbill came to her rescue. "This way, Mama!" Roz didn't hesitate. She launched herself up from the shallows toward her son's voice. Salt water streamed off her body as she soared through the air, and then her feet pounded into the sand beside Brightbill, who was perched atop an old rowboat. By the time Shadow arrived, our friends were rowing away from shore. The dog's face twisted with rage, and he howled from the water's edge. "You made a fool out of me, Roz. My pack and my mate have left me. Now I'm just a worthless lone wolf. All because of you." Roz felt sorry for Shadow. She never meant for any of this to happen. But she did have her own troubles. The robot's greatest fear was deep water, and now she was paddling through the waves and out to sea.